My name is Timothy Coombs. I'm a professor at Eastern Illinois University, and I'll be talking about a theory of crisis communication called situational crisis communication theory. One of the questions I'm often asked is, why do we need theory and research in crisis communication? Shouldn't this just be common sense? And on one hand, yes, it should be common sense, but we see with all the mistakes organizations make in crisis communication that there is need for theory and research because organizations often make their situations worse. What we find that much of the advice they receive is actually just speculation. It's never been tested. And theory and research allows us to take those ideas and test them and create what we call evidence-based management. And crises are a serious time, and during that time it would be better for managers to rely on evidence-based ideas rather than just speculation. In the vein of trying to create evidence-based management, over the past 10 years I've been working on a theory known as situational crisis communication theory. And it's actually inspired by attribution theory coming from psychological research. The idea that a crisis, no matter how well it's handled, is still a negative event. And when your stakeholders experience these negative events, they try and make sense of the situation, and they make attributions about responsibility. They are trying to decide whether you, as an organization, are responsible for what happened, or if it was something in your environment that you couldn't control. And it's much harsher for an organization when they attribute responsibility to the organization. And that sort of has served as a foundation to inspire the work in situational crisis communication theory, to try and identify what factors shape how stakeholders perceive a crisis. Given its roots in attribution theory, the central point of situational crisis communication theory is the idea of crisis responsibility. How will your stakeholders perceive your organization as being responsible or not responsible for the crisis? And what we have done is developed a system and tested this system of assessment that's based on two parts. The first part is to look at the general type of crisis your organization is encountering. And we've found through research and discussion with stakeholders, they can be divided into three groups. One is a victim, where there's very little responsibility. And in fact, the organization itself is a victim of the crisis. The second one is accidental. There's minimal responsibility here for the crisis, as there are other factors that contributed to it, and it might be something such as the weather. And the third one, and the most difficult to actually manage, is the preventable crisis. And that's where your stakeholders strongly believe that your organization is responsible for that crisis. In addition to that base set of types, which frame how people view the crisis, we found two intensifying factors. And those a history of crises and also a prior negative reputation. If either of those exist, you've had some prior crises, or your reputation is rather negative before the crisis begins, people will attribute much greater responsibility to you for the crisis. So it's important as a crisis manager to consider not only the crisis type, but also look at the intensifying factors when trying to decide how much responsibility your stakeholders are attributing to your organization for that crisis event. One of our primary goals with situational crisis communication theory was to come up with communicative advice for crisis managers. What should you say and do during a crisis? What we have found is there is a base response that can be used and should be used across all different types of crises. And that base is composed of two parts. The first part is to help people prevent further harm. That you need to provide information to your stakeholders that they can use to protect themselves physically from the crisis. Many crises pose a risk to people. If there's a chemical release, people might have to evacuate from an area. Or if there's a harmful product, people need to know that so that they don't buy it or they return that product. And that's the idea of taking care of them physically first. The second part of it is to help people cope psychologically with a crisis. Victims do experience psychological distress to varying degrees during a crisis, and your communication can help them work through that. One way is to provide what's termed corrective information. Tell people what you're doing to prevent another crisis. Because as a victim of a crisis, one of your concerns is this is going to happen again. So it's important for companies to say what's being done to prevent a repeat of the crisis. The next part of the idea of psychologically coping is to express sympathy to the victims. This should be a natural occurrence for managers. You feel badly when people are injured, so do express sympathy. People expect that, and it does help them feel better psychologically when companies express that sympathy. And it is important to know that this is evidence-based management, that we have looked across a number of crisis situations and found that this base is an effective way of handling pretty much every type of crisis you will encounter as a crisis manager. What we have found is that as responsibility for a crisis increases, that an organization has to respond in kind. What this means is the stronger your stakeholders attribute responsibility for the crisis to your organization, the more your response has to be perceived as accepting responsibility for that crisis. So if you're in a very minor crisis situation, very little responsibility, not much damage, all you would really need is the base response we talked about before. But if you're in a preventable crisis and there's serious damage that has been done, people have been injured and potentially killed in a crisis, you need to make sure that you're what we call accommodative in that situation and focus your response on helping the victims and taking responsibility for that crisis. Knowing the situation will help you shape the right response so that you neither underreact nor overreact to a crisis. A crisis is a very dangerous time for an organization, and that's not the time to rely on speculation. But managers should be looking at the advice they are giving and try and sort through the speculation from what is evidence-based. And it's our hope through the research that we do in this field that we can supply you with more evidence-based management for improving your crisis communication.